So welcome everyone. I'm so excited to hear about stone fruit and get to imagine. I haven't finished it all yet. I have a little bit left. So no spoiler. No, just
No spoiler alert.
don't spoil the end to me. So I just wanted to do a few housekeeping things. Please, Dorothy's going to do a short presentation in the beginning, so if you want to just keep muted until that's over. And then after that, Patricia McIntyre, our president of the Alliance of the Swope, is going to take over. She's also our ethicist. Um, and, um, and then you guys are welcome to have conversations. And I will monitor the chat. So if you want to write something in the chat, then I will go ahead and ask that for Dorothy. But you'll be able to unmute and have a conversation, since this is conversation with the author. And we're very, very lucky to have Dorothy with us today. So I'll go ahead and turn it over then.
Thank you, Hilda. And I want everybody to look at Hilda's background. She has the painting, thank you, Spring in Town by Grant Wood up. And I know you've just all heard from Paul Jewell on this wonderful painting. And I'm so glad Paul's here today, Barbara Feller's here today. They are definitely Grant Wood researchers and enthusiasts. And Paul and Barbara, feel free to join in today. I would love it. But with that, this is how I got to connect with the Swope. I had made a decision to recreate that quilt that you see in Spring in Town. And in fact, that quilt is behind me. And how we connected with the Swope is I thought, I want to get the exact pattern. I want to get the exact colors of the quilt. And one day, something popped in my head that said, call the museum that has that painting and see if they can tell you what the colors are. And the Swope was terrific. They actually gave me the code, colors, everything. I sent those colors off to a college friend who is a historical quilt maker, and she replicated that quilt, which you see behind me. And it's always somewhat hard on the internet to look at paintings because the colors can somewhat vary, but the colors back here are actually the true colors thanks to the Swope providing that to me. Well, that started a connection, and it was Ed who asked me, so Dorothy, why are you asking about these colors for this quilt? So I told him, hey, I'm writing this book, but I'm also very much interested in Grant Wood. And last spring, right before COVID, the Swope actually had my quilt and had put it there in a display around the painting Spring in Town. So that's how I got connected with all of you. So very excited for that. And like they said, my name is Dorothy Montgomery, but the first thing I really want to do is to thank all of you for reading my book. I want to thank the Swope for all your great support. It's been a wonderful relationship and connection. We'll never forget it, but thank you definitely for reading my book. So I want to give a little bit of background about me. And I know that sometimes on Zoom, your video can sometimes cover up a little bit of these slides. So I try to move everything to the left. But I'm actually from Grant Wood's hometown, which is Anamosa, Iowa. A little bit more about me. I've lived in 3 states. I actually started to write this book in Colorado, where I lived after growing up in Iowa. And right now I live in Simi Valley, California, which is just northwest of Los Angeles. My interests, you can see, are writing, genealogy, history, of course, Grant Wood. So you get a sense of why I wrote a historical fiction novel. My philosophy in life, what I do for a living is I teach leadership development. And so I'm always about helping everybody live to their greatest potential. And then a perfect day, and I think Paul Jewell can connect with this, is a perfect day is when you can make connections, you're inspired by the research, you feel the sense of purpose and contribution, and you're having fun. So whenever Paul and I write emails, we're always saying, isn't this so much fun? So that's the perfect day, which means just getting to write all day long. So the book that you read is a fictional book. And what's interesting, at the time I started to write it, it was actually 20 years ago. And it was something I was kind of, thinking about. I started to get hooked. I'm going to tell you about that in a moment on Grant Wood. But actually, when I first pitched this book to some local presses in the Iowa area, the first thing they did was shut me down. They said, Nan Wood Graham, Grant Wood's sister, and of course, the iconic face of American Gothic, the publisher said never wanted anything printed that was not truthful about her and her family. And I respected that. And so that's why it took me a little while to write this book, because I thought, I've got this great story in mind, but maybe that's not what the Wood family wanted. So what I did is, when I finally did decide to get it published, I put what was true at the back of the book. And that was my way to honor Nan's wishes, that they do care about the truth. And part of that is they have a Quaker heritage. And Quakers believe in the importance of reading and believing in truth, because they believe that if you read and you base your life in truth, you bring on good deeds. And so I tried to honor a lot of their heritage. But the story is about, as you all know, about a woman who comes back reluctantly to Iowa to write about the death of Nan Wood Graham, that famous face of American Gothic. And the other inspiration for that piece was that Nan actually passed away on my birthday, my 30th birthday. So I felt a lot of connections to this entire story. And what you're going to find is everything in my book, there's a lot of meaning to it. Everything has meaning, and I'll share a few of those fun facts. But you'll soon see how I wove the story together. So I'm going to start with Grant Wood's 1930 painting of Stone City. And as you read in my book, a lot of the story took place in Stone City. And Stone City is an actual village. And in fact, it looks a lot like this today, even though this is from 1930. But when Grant painted this, this was to him the ideal landscape. And I'll tell you, growing up in local Iowa in this area, I hope you hear this respectfully, everybody had a print of this in their homes, but we kind of thought, he's okay. You know, we saw the round trees, we saw the little bobble trees in the background. The local citizens liked it, but also didn't think too much about it. And that was part of the flavor of my book, is sometimes you don't appreciate what you have in your own backyard. But this print was in my parents' house. It was the first thing I saw in the morning leaving for school. And of course, it was the first thing I saw coming home from school. And in fact, this painting depicts my childhood bus route to school in Anamosa. My parents lived in Anamosa. I was born there, but they moved out to a farm just west of Anamosa near the villages of Viola and Stone City. So Stone City is west of Anamosa, which is eastern Iowa, which is about 3.5 hours straight west of Chicago. We're not far from the Mississippi River. That's why you see a lot of rolling hills in this area. So yes, this was my school bus route. And I'll tell you, the hill behind where the road curves and it goes up the hill, that's actually a very steep hill that the bus route used to go up, and then we go east into Anamosa. If you ever have a chance to see this painting in real, it's at the, of course, the Joslin Art Museum in Omaha, Nebraska. I highly recommend it. It's incredible painting. In fact, when you see it in real life, the corn shimmers below us, some of the trees shimmer, and where you see the bend in the road, where that curve, there's a billboard there. And you can read the billboard. In fact, it says, "It satisfies." And once again, that was Grant Wood's way of saying, this is home. This is the ideal place. So how my story of writing the book began was at Christmas, when my husband wanted to take my son and I to New York City. And I'll never forget, I was excited. We're going at Christmas time, and I had all this agenda I wanted to do. And my husband said, "I want you to go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art." And I remember saying to him, "Honey, it's Christmas in New York. I want to go shopping. I want to see Broadway. Who wants to go to a museum?" But he said, "I promise you will really like it. Trust me." Well, he was wrong. I didn't just like it, I loved it. And in fact, when we went to the American Artists Wing, there was this display of regionalist paintings. And I'm like, "Regionalist, who's that?" And my husband said, "You know, there's a painting over here by Grant Wood." And I remember thinking, what? And we saw The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere at the Met. And Grant Wood's mother used to share this poem with him. She'd often read it. It's really a childhood memory. So you kind of get this feel of a little bit of childhood from this painting. Also with the regionalists was Edward Hopper from the Northeast. And this is the Lighthouse of Two Lights. Another painting was John Brown by John Stewart Curry, a Kansas regionalist. What I loved about this painting is it reminded me of my grandfather, who grew up right on the border of Kansas and Missouri and used to share these stories about the border wars. So I'm starting to feel very much at home here. And then here's July Hay by Thomas Hart Benton from Missouri. My mother's from Missouri, so I just started to really feel a connection to these artists. So you're going to laugh, and this shows my ignorance at the time. But when I saw the Grant Wood painting, I kind of went, wow, that guy from my hometown, he did pretty good. He's got a he's got a painting in a major museum. Of course, the laugh's on me. But I came home and I got very curious about Grant Wood. And one of the things I remembered was that we had a Grant Wood store. It's now called the Grant Wood Art Gallery, but this is it in Anamosa. And notice the stone where it's right underneath that tourist information sign. That is Stone City stone. That comes out of the quarries of that town, and that's what that town's known for. There used to be many quarries. It's down to one today, but you see the stone wherever you go in Grant Wood country. So when I walked into the store, I was thinking about writing a book. In fact, I was thinking about writing about a couple who had met, and I started to around Stone City. And what's interesting, when I saw this photo, this is kind of pre-internet time. There wasn't a lot out there about Grant Wood and the Stone City Art Colony. And I remember saying, I recognize Grant Wood, but who are these people? Well, they said there was an art colony in 1932, 1933 in Stone City. I thought, wow, I've grown up here all my life. I never knew about this. And they said, this is the faculty that taught there. And we're trying to figure out who these names are. And back in the day, like I said, there was no way to Google this on an internet. The local citizens of Anamosa were trying to say who these people were and couldn't really depict them all. But what you can see in the center is that stone fruit basket. And that was my idea around my story. And this is in front of Green Mansion. And Green Mansion, of course, was one of the locations in my book. But this faculty, what I love about it, these are all stories waiting to happen because they all went on to do some great things. Most of them were from the Art Institute of Chicago. They were also Iowa-based art professors, and they all did this for free, coming to a little town in Iowa during the Depression, teaching art of all kinds, painting, lithographs, framing, just all kinds of sketching, drawing, sculpting. And the woman to the left that you see there, her name was Grace Boston. Now you know where I got one of the names in my book for Rose Boston. Grace actually was kind of the key administrator running the show there at the mansion. So my question in that store that day was, is there someone from the Stone City Art Colony that is still alive? And they said, yes, her name is Isabelle Bloom. And I thought, oh, I bet she just ended up around Anamosa. So I remember, this dates my book a little bit, but I remember going out to a phone booth and looking up Isabelle Bloom and not finding that woman. So I went to a friend's house and I asked, her mother was there, and her mother said, Dorothy, what are you doing while you're here in Anamosa? And I said, well, I'm thinking about writing a book about Grant Wood. And I'm curious now about the Stone City Art Colony. That was in the summers of 32, 33. And I said, the volunteer there gave me the name of a woman by the name of Isabelle Bloom. Does that sound familiar? And my friend's mother said, yes. In fact, she's a well-known sculptor from the Davenport area. And I said, funny, I'm heading to Davenport. And what I'll tell you about as I wrote this book, and maybe some of you have written books, the synchronicities just started to happen. It was in this incredible journey. I'm showing you this painting again because I want to show you where the art colony was compared to this painting. You see the church on the left, which is a Catholic church. The Stone City Art Colony was actually across the road from that church up on a high hill. So you can kind of get a sense that Grant was on a lot of hills and he loved to paint some of these landscapes and scenery. But here is the woman who I ended up talking to in Davenport. Her name is Isabelle Bloom. If you go to the internet and look up ibloom.com, I-B-L-O-O-M, you're gonna see the work that she did, but she was a student of Grant Wood's as well as her husband. And she became my Rose Boston in my book. So this is the first summer of the Stone City Art Colony. You see Grant Wood in the overalls in the far left. You might have to move your video screens, but over to the right, you'll see Isabelle and her husband, John Bloom. She did meet him at the art colony. She was sculpting stone from the quarry. He was a friend of Grant Wood's. He couldn't afford the colony, but Grant, who was always very benevolent, made him a groundskeeper. And he was cleaning up after Isabelle often because she was just sculpting away all this sandy limestone. And by cleaning up her messes, he fell in love with her. So the day I went to Davenport, I took my son to that hockey camp and I told him, I'm gonna leave for about an hour. I wanna go check out this store, this woman called Isabelle Bloom. And the reason I'm showing you this, Patrice's trip to Davenport is my true story. So I was in a line of women that the line went out the door at half an hour before the door opened. And I remember asking a woman in line, what is the big deal about Isabelle Bloom? Well, she explained that it was a lot like a Precious Moments, that she did these wonderful statues and she often retired them and people were in line trying to get the retired pieces. But she was a local celebrity actually in Davenport. She was a well-known artist. She had a children's art show and her husband was the last of the regional artists as well, John Bloom. So when I walked into this little store, once again, this is how naive I was writing all of this story, is I walked to the clerk and just said, can I talk to Isabelle Bloom? And the clerk kind of laughed, honey, she's like in her 90s, she's retired, she sold this business 5 years ago. But they handed me a brochure, and as I walked around this building to the right, one of the things I saw on the wall was this slate, an old school slate, and it had a phone number on it, a 319 area code, which is Eastern Iowa. And something in my heart told me that is Isabelle's phone number, because only in Iowa, probably Indiana too, would someone put out their phone number in public. I wrote down that phone number and I left that store and I went to a phone booth and I called it. And I was shaking. And the person on the other end answers the phone call and says, Bloom residence. So I knew I had Isabelle Bloom. And I said, may I talk to Isabelle? What is this about? And I said, you know, I've kind of bumbled around. I just like to talk to her. And finally, they were about ready to hang up on me. And I said, it's about the Stone City Art Colony. And they said, just a moment. And I heard voices and they said, come tomorrow at 1 o'clock. And so true to that story that you read about Patrice, going to meet the Bostons, that was my story in meeting the Blooms. Unfortunately, their health was failing at the time. She had Parkinson's, but the one thing she kept saying to me is Stone City is a magical place. Stone City is a magical place. So when I wrote that dream sequence in my book, that was based on this woman saying, that's an incredible place. And so that story in the book was actually my story. So this is the Stone City Art Colony. You read about the ice wagons, which was my favorite part of learning about the art colony, that they only expected 20 students. They had close to 90 that first summer. They didn't know where to house them. They had a little space there in Green Mansion that you see behind you. On the third floor, Grant Wood even put in showers and a little bit of dormitory work in the basement. This house didn't have a lot of electricity. Grant had to kind of play groundskeeper himself and kind of work this facility to make it applicable for students to come. But they got the idea for the ice wagons to house additional students. Some painted them there on the grounds. Some took them down to the river, which you saw in the painting, Stone City, which is the Wapsipinicon River. And they painted them and lived in them. And I just love that idea that I wrote that into my book. And in fact, this is Grant's ice wagon. He had John Bloom stayed with him. They just put like cots and bunks in these things, so maybe a little bit of mosquito netting. But this painting is of Estes Park, Colorado. And when I lived in Colorado, I didn't live far from Estes Park, my family and I. So this became the inspiration. And Hilda, I won't give you a spoilage alert, but some of you know what's hidden behind this painting that I had at the Boston's house. So this was the inspiration for that. Then the other thing I found in doing the research is that when they had the Stone City Art Colony, the students would get into cars and go roam the countryside, and they would just stop and paint anywhere. Well, this is Viola, Iowa. As a child, I rode my bike by this corner numerous times because my grade school was just a block or two beyond this. But I love this picture, and I did have a beloved aunt who told me about how when she was younger, she used to go on a milk route with her father, the old kind of milk route with the horse and the cart. And they would go up and down the streets of Anamosa, and they would see these painters. They would go in the countryside and they would see just painters on the side of the road. Now think of someone about 50 years later going, this all happened in my own neighborhood, had no idea. But they'd love to do that. So then the last story I want to really share with you is the story of John Stewart Curry coming to Stone City. John Stewart Curry, as you all know, did the tragic Prelude, one of my favorite paintings, one of his most famous. He also did Tornado over Kansas. And I have to tell you, when you think of synchronicities, once again, you might have to move your video screens over, but there's a boy in this painting with a black cat. That is exact image of my son when he was 10. And my son is on the line today, and he will tell you, when I first saw that, yes, that is me. And so just all these synchronicities just were falling in my lap. But John Stewart Curry was one of the regionalists, and he was great friends with Grant Wood, as well as Thomas Hart Benton, and they often spent time together. Well, John Stewart Curry was curious because Grant Wood was loved in Iowa. Curry was not. And the reason Curry wasn't loved, I should say, in Kansas by his own native state is because the paintings he did depicted the things that Kansans wanted to forget about. You know, tornadoes, how they're depicted religiously, the border wars. He didn't want to be reminded of that. And of course, if you ever get to the state capital of Topeka in Kansas and see John Stewart Curry's work, I'm sure they're glad they hung on to it because it's exquisite. So Curry comes to Iowa. He saw the painting of Stone City. He thought, there's no such place like that. And he was curious why Wood was loved. So he came to the art colony. Wood actually had him stay in his ice wagon. Curry ended up teaching a class and wanted to come back for the summer of '34 and paint and teach. But unfortunately, the art colony financially lost some money. They couldn't stay open for another year. And actually, Grant Wood, too, went to become a professor at the University of Iowa in '34. But when Curry came, I love the fact that he put on overalls. He kind of joined in the fun, but he got the sense of Stone City in the painting and what Wood was trying to express in that painting. So I love that story. And of course, this is the three regionalists. That's Thomas Hart Benton on the left. Wow. And they had a lot of fun together. But what really inspired me to write that book was because what I felt was the regionalists, they broke what I believe is a glass ceiling that great art comes from Europe. And coming into the 1930s, Americans did believe that great art came from Europe. And in fact, these three men showed that you can paint what's in your backyard, you can depict locally what's important to you, what you love. And when they did that, their greatest work came through. And that's what I love about this story, is they really showed Americans that we can have great American painters. And of course, these gentlemen went overseas, they learned from the great masters, but they brought it home and they brought their own style with it. And then I can't forget Nan. This book was really for Nan, who adored her brother. She was very protective of him, really created a circle of friends that were very protective around Grant. Debbie Beilstein, who gave me this picture, is on this session today, so glad to have her. She's actually knew Nan and spent many, many years with Nan and provided this picture. And if you look on the back, Nan's a little worried that she looks a little plump here. But this picture of Nan was taken the same year American Gothic was painted, 1930. And so you see in American Gothic, her face is very thin and narrow, making her look older. But she had that round face just like her brother Grant. But to me, this book was really dedicated to her. So this quote by Grant Wood says, "My early work is the result of going around that very territory where I lived and not seeing it. I so identify with Grant Wood. I did the same thing. I didn't realize what I had in my backyard, I didn't realize sometimes the importance of home. And that book is dedicated to my realization. It's really the Dorothy Gale book from The Wizard of Oz, that everything you ever wanted was in your own backyard. And that's what a lot of that book is about. So this is my favorite picture of Grant Wood at the University of Iowa. He was interviewed by Life magazine in 1939, of course, about 3 years before the passing of, of him. But he left us in Iowa a great legacy, and he also left a wonderful legacy for America with his paintings, but especially American Gothic, which is now timeless. As you all know, it's one of the top 3 most recognizable paintings in the world, American Gothic is. And I just think that's the greatest gift anybody can leave, is leaving something that we all care about, but also becoming immortal. So a few fun facts, and then I'm going to open it up to all of you, is when I was researching the book, I was at the Davenport Museum, like you saw Patrice, and that was the day I got to see the brooch. But I wrote the brooch into the story that Patrice actually was the owner of that. But the day I was there, it was true that the curator at the time, it was called the Davenport Museum of Art. Now it's the Figge. They have created a new museum. But at the time, the curator told me she wanted to get rid of all of Grant Wood's estate that Nan had provided with Davenport. I remember that was the first time I really understood how I felt about Grant Wood. I said, why would you get rid of our state's treasure? And she said, you know, nobody cares about it. And now the Figge does, but at that time, she was thinking about getting rid of it. Well, what's kind of interesting, that same day, they were meeting in the museum about the Iowa State Quarter. If you remember all the state quarters that came out around 2004, 2005, and you can see this is the Iowa State Quarter. And a woman said, stopped me in the hallway. She said, I heard you're writing a book about Grant Wood. And I said, yes, I'm considering it. And she said, we're talking about the Iowa State Quarter. And what I said to that woman, and I said, please don't put another pig or cow on anything Iowa or cornstalk. We've done that enough. I said, I think we should honor Grant Wood. And she said, we wanted to put American Gothic on the Iowa State Quarter, but she said getting, you know, the rights were so expensive. So I said, please do something with Grant Wood. Well, they did come out with the Iowa State Quarter with Arbor Day, Grant Wood's painting from 1931. So I was so pleased that maybe I had a little bit something to do with the state quarter, or I like to think that, but that's just a fun fact the day I was there at the Davenport Art Museum. Some other fun facts I just want to share with you is, you can kind of tell I'm a gal who loves meaning. I love connection. These are just a few facts I wrote, but I wanted people to get a sense of what it was like to live in Iowa. Yeah, I've had some people say to me, kind of like, why does Patrice apologize for being from Iowa? Well, you know, Iowans are often, we're stereotyped. We're stereotyped as being farmers. We're stereotyped as not being educated, when actually the opposite is true, or the opposite is the truth, is we're very educated. That's why Arbor Day was such a perfect pick for our state quarter, because we were known for our high excellence in education. The other thing too, I wanted people to know what it was like to grow up in Jones County. You read in my book about the farmer that had the airport in his back field. We had a lot of flying farmers. And in fact, the gentleman who lived near our farm, who had his airport in his back field, his daughter was named Patrice. And that's where I got the name for the book. Patrice is actually a childhood friend of mine. She's also someone who had a French heritage. And I remember in school when we had to stand up and say what our heritage was. In Eastern Iowa, we were very German, we're very Irish. And one day Patrice stands up and, you know, when we were talking about our heritage, and said, my heritage is French. And I remember thinking that was so exotic for Eastern Iowa. And I wanted my character to feel like she didn't belong. So that's how I came up with the name Patrice. The name Powell is actually the name of a well-known newspaper owner and editor in Anamosa during the 50s. Hello.
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 Uh-oh.
I just wanted to make sure someone had a question. All right. So Powell was the name of a newspaper man that really captured a lot of
I'm
these
good.
stories.
How are you?
So I wanted to share that with you too. There's another piece in the book
Okay.
about
I'm
the
going to go over now and pick up our
campfire
salads.
girls,
Oh, wait,
and
she
that was
likes the
actually
chicken,
true.
right?
Dorothy,
I was actually,
I just,
Okay.
Dorothy, would everybody please
All
mute
righty.
their phones? We're hearing a
All
telephone
righty.
conversation that we don't need to hear.
Well, while it's nice out. Very good. Bye-bye.
Okay. Go ahead, Dorothy. Thank you.
no worries. I'm almost done too. But the name Powell was for a neighbor of ours who was a newspaper editor who wrote a lot of the stories about Grant Wood, about our festivals, about Paul Engel, the director of the Iowa Writers Workshop. So Powell was the name of a newspaper editor. So the uncle in the book is based on that family friend, Powell. The other thing too about growing up in Jones County, you saw a part in the story where Patrice talks about people driving and they wave with a finger. I don't know if they do that in Indiana, but in Eastern Iowa, you go by somebody, yep, and they raise their finger and that's how they say hello as they drive. So I was trying to build in a lot of those Iowa isms, kind of the, you know, you're from Iowa way kind of thing. But hopefully you got a little bit of flavor of Jones County through the book. And it's been a really fun experience. My hometown was very welcoming about the book. I was very shy, I'll be honest, to bring it out and say, hey, everybody from my hometown, I wrote this book. But I think what they liked about it was they could live in that book, just like I felt like I grew up living in that painting of Stone City. So with that, I'll open it up for questions.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you for all of the slides, all of the images from Stone City that I certainly had never seen before, and they are not commonly circulated. So I very much appreciate that. I'll lead off with a question, and that is that you did a lot of historical research and you talk about it as being an historical novel, but it's really written through very much contemporary family dynamics. And that was a fascinating way to present a lot of disparate information and make it work. Why did you do it that way? Rather than just write something set in the 1930s and beginning and ending in the 1930s, what attracted you about the modern family dynamic as a means to explain Stone City?
That's a great question. And I have to tell you, I started to write a book about Grant Wood in the 30s. Like, you know, it started off with him walking the road of Stone City, heading up to this art colony. But I think what some of the inspiration for it was, you know, I remember starting to write it to think, would someone be interested in an Iowa story? And it wasn't until The Bridges of Madison County came out, Field of Dreams, you know, Shoeless Joe Jackson came out, that I thought, okay, maybe someone would be interested in an Iowa story. And I think for Field of Dreams, I like that it was more of a contemporary, but went back to history. So I would say probably that book, The Field of Dreams, really inspired a lot of that style. But I think I wanted to tell the story of what it's like to be local and not appreciate Grant Wood. In fact, I had a cousin who read my book and said, I'm so glad you started off the book kind of saying like, we didn't think he was very good, because there was a lot of that local feeling. So I think I wanted to bring that in. And I think with the family dynamics, I wanted to show an appreciation of someone coming back home. And I think, and that's funny, that part of the book has really hit home with a lot of people. I know I have some friends who, they're sisters, and they really related to that book, that one left home, one didn't. What does that do to family dynamics? And I think it's a little bit of my story of not that my family has reacted to my leaving home, but sometimes I wanted people to know that sometimes it's hard to leave home. And it's hard to come back because there's a lot of mixed emotions around it. So I guess that's a little bit of my story.
Well, interestingly, maybe that's what attracted me to that question, was that's my story too. I'm the one that left and everybody else stayed in the Northwest. And I recognized a lot of Patrice in my own history. So that may be part of what made that contemporary story so interesting, and quite apart from the romance with the man from New York. But I've had a question. Who else is interested in raising a question for Dorothy?
I'm interested in asking Dorothy about the dream sequence. I just love that part of the book, you know, where she's just there on the remnants of the stone mansion, and she just starts to imagine all those people there painting back in the 30s, and the little girl that comes up and talks to her. I thought that was just beautiful. And I just wondered where your inspiration came for that.
And Kathy, I'm so glad you asked that question. I've been waiting for someone to ask me that question. You're the first one, other than my mother. But my mother loved that part too. Yeah, that's one of my favorite scenes. It goes from Isabelle Bloom, or who was Rose Boston in my book, saying Stone City's a magical place. So I wanted to show something magical. And I think the dream sequence is also kind of a nod to an aunt of mine who has passed away, who is the one I told you about, who would go on the milk route with her father, seeing the artist. But she had really inspired me too around, she did a lot of artwork. So kind of like I said, I didn't think I grew up around art, or my love of art started back then, but it did through the people I knew and the place I grew up. But how I came up with that dream sequence is, at the time I was reading some book about what if before you were born, you made kind of a blueprint for your life, and you could design it any way you wanted. And so I thought of these artists coming to the Stone City site, to the mansion grounds, and designing their life to work with a great artist such as Grant Wood. And that's how I wrote it.
And then the little girl turning out to be her aunt, possibly, when she spoke to her mother. That was beautiful too.
Yes.
Really good story.
Thank you. Thank you. And Patricia, I'm still thinking about your question too, I have to admit, because I'm thinking, yeah, why did I kind of do a contemporary feel to it? I think that just got my writing juices going to attack it that way.
Well, it gave the reader a really good access point for moving back into history, because Stone City is not common currency among, you know, conversation, and it is not a history that not only many people don't know, but it's not something that's taken as being really pivotal in the history of American art. And the more I looked at your book, and the more I sort of started reading up about Stone City afterward, it really was pivotal in the way American art transferred its emphasis from Europe to the United States. Because a lot of Grant Wood stuff is really headed toward abstraction.
Yes.
And he's just finding exactly the pivot point between the historical sort of landscape painting and modern art. And I don't know that anybody has ever really looked at him that way, and just in terms of art history, let alone as, you know, an educator and a mentor and a motivator. So that was a really interesting kind of sidelight insight that I had to the book.
And that was what my research uncovered too, was I was amazed that a lot of the art in America was more portrait, right? Kind of your face and, you know, your upper torso. That was the way they felt Americans did art. But these regionalists started to do, you know, scenes of people working and scenes of people just living and just everyday life, which wasn't common for American artists to do. And so you're right, it did end up moving toward abstraction as far as the future of a lot of American art. But during that time, they did show that, you know, great art can come from the American soil.
Is there any research or funding anywhere to try to do, not recreate Stone City, because you couldn't really recreate it, but to build a resource center around it, build a museum or something that would concentrate precisely on that. I asked because we have here in Indiana, there is a city called New Goshen that was a very important transcendentalist community in the prior century. And it has become quite an interesting cultural tourism attraction. And it seems to be like Stone City would be right in that same vein of places where you'd find a lot of interest once people found out where it was and knew what its history was.
Well, I might mention, Dorothy, and Patricia, I agree totally with what you're saying about this transition and the important role that regionalism had. I might mention that here in Iowa City, Grant Wood's home, 1142 East Court Street, is owned by a man named Jim Hayes, a lawyer, and he has deeded it to the University of Iowa. And not only that, but he 4 adjoining lots with houses on them, and they house artists of all kinds here at the university during their stay here. So that whole concept, the Grant Wood Art Colony here in Iowa City, meets some of that Stone City concept. Not all of it, and it's not just for painters, but it does meet some of them. I might mention too, Dorothy, that, and I've told you this before, but the other viewers might be interested in it. I'm not a novel reader, but I love the way Dorothy had at the end of the book the things that were that she had changed a little bit as part of her story, because as historians, I think that I was glad to see that. So it didn't put wonder in my brain in terms of, well, did she discover something I didn't know? And is that true or is that false? I loved the novel, and I've told Dorothy this several times. But I hope that clarifies a few things there too.
No, thank you, Paul. Go ahead.
So I have a
I-
question. Was Grant Wood ever married?
He was.
Yes, he was.
Dorothy, we're going to continue then. Does he have something?
Oh, just real quick, I will have Paul talk about Grant Wood being married,
Whoops,
which
have
he
we lost?
was.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Here we go. I think we had a glitch there for a minute. Is everybody back?
Okay. Can you
Okay.
hear me
Yes.
okay?
Yes, he was married for a rather short period of time, a couple of years. The marriage did not work out well for them. Grant had thought he was marrying a woman of the arts. She was a singer and a performer, and had had some opportunities in New York and Chicago. She was from Jones County, the same county he was from. And they married before Grant's mother had died. And she kind of took care of Hattie, his mother, for the months before Hattie passed. But there was conflicts, I think, right from the beginning in terms of what she thought her role as a wife was and how Grant was viewing it. It was also a marriage that was opposed by many of Grant's friends because they didn't think he was of the nature to have a wife, and that he would be probably better off without one. But there was a lot of social pressures at that time to marry. Sarah, after the divorce, left. And just as an aside, those of you that saw my presentation, I'm friends with a woman that was a housekeeper at 103 of Grant Wood. And she said to me one time that Grant had said to her just one thing when he left the house when she was first employed. He said, just remember one thing, if a gray-haired woman comes to that door, don't let her in. And he was referring, of course, to Sarah. Sarah ended up in Washington State, and recently some of her items have been brought back to the State Historical Society here in Iowa City to complete that story of Sarah. She had been married before. She had one son by that marriage who was a dentist, and a couple of grandchildren too. So I could go on a lot about that, but that gives you a little background on that marriage.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, so Patricia, when you talked about,
I'm sorry, was somebody speaking? Okay, well, I'm learning a lot about Iowa. And one of the things of this reticence to, not only reticence to boast, but just kind of general reserve of nature. And I wonder if that is something that has to be overcome a little bit by somebody like Patrice, who gets out of there, discovers other things about the world, and then can maybe go back and start bringing Grant Wood and the other regionalists who were there into the more public attention. It's almost protective of them. And I know in your book, there are a couple of people, Rose Boston and other people, are very protective of
Yes.
the sensitive people and don't appear not to want it to be made very public or commercialize it. Is that maybe just an Iowa thing?
Well, to give you a couple of answers to that, I almost ended the book where Patrice had started kind of a historical center across the road from the Green Mansion. In fact, I started to write an ending that she came back to do that. I am actually writing a trilogy now around Patrice and her adventure that keeps bringing her home. I will tell you, at one time, we started a Grant Wood Festival in Anamosa in 1973. In my book, I made it 72 because I had to play with the timing of her age. But we used to have these festivals where we used to have 10,000 people come back for this. And the last person who was running the festival, she worked very, very hard, Christy Rain, but she eventually just couldn't keep doing it anymore. Well, we really lost our festival, you could say. There's one in September now in Stone City, but it's not at the expansiveness that it once was. So part of writing this book, and Paul and Barbara Feller on the phone know this too, is that I am hoping to get back the enthusiasm of Grant Wood in this area. It's not to say it's died, it's just kind of gotten lost a little bit. And we are wanting, there's a statue of American Gothic that's been traveling the world. And Anamosa, I think to purchase this statue, it's like about a 2-storied statue. It's something like $30,000 or more. A friend of and I are thinking about, we're going to do like a crowdfunding to try to purchase this statue because the city of Anamosa cannot afford to do it. So Patricia, to your point, we've had these surges of honoring him, of doing these things, but it's really just finding someone who wants to really own it and drive it and keep it going. And part of Paul and Barbara Feller and another colleague, Elaine Mattingly, we're trying to bring this enthusiasm back to get some of these things done.
Great.
We just need those next generations, right, to help too.
Yes. Yeah, especially now because that generation who lived it is no longer able to tell. Is that, I'm interested in Rose Boston and her angels and her figurines, and you're talking about Isabelle Bloom sort of shed some light on that, but in the book, it is clear that it isn't the pieces themselves that connect the owners to them sentimentally, is that Rose made them.
Mm-hmm.
And was that intentional to sort of bring craft art to the fore as having a different kind of meaning from what we would consider high art?
I think bringing her into the story was mainly about the fact that there was someone still living that went to the art colony, could speak about the art colony in Grant Wood, but also it was showing that Grant had inspired all kinds of artists, right? And to think of this woman doing sculpture work and doing it extremely well and creating a business around it, especially back in the 40s and 50s, you know, that was unheard of at the time. But I think it just lends an air of, there's a lot of different ways to express yourself and express art. And it was just like you said, a very unique variance to a story of a lot of paintings, you could say. Does that help?
Yes, thank you. And it is interesting that when you visit people's homes or you see people at times of loss, it's usually something sort of sentimental rather than monetary in value that becomes the thing that is kept, that the next generation keeps. And it's sort of like the brooch. It's not because there is any great intrinsic value in the item, but it opens this door of memory that gives you place and scope and location on the planet that nothing else really does. And it's interesting that the brooch served the same function in some way that the angels did.
Yes, and in fact, my home here in California, it's funny, I live in California, but my whole home is full of regionalist prints and Isabelle Bloom figurines. So it's a total Iowa house. So why I'm in California, I don't know, because everything in my house is Iowa and regionalists and all the sculptures of Isabelle Bloom. And even today, the Isabelle Bloom was bought by a woman that they were trying to manufacture a lot of things in China just to, you know, save costs. But the locals rebelled, me including, saying we want to know that it's sculpted and made in Iowa based on Isabelle Bloom's work. And so the ones that I buy are the ones that I really know were designed by Isabelle Bloom. So I agree with you. It's got to have some meaning to it.
Yeah.
I wanted to mention,
Sorry, Kathy, hold on. There are a couple of comments in the chat. Let's see. Diane Keys is asking if you or Paul or Barbara could talk about the art fairs in Stone City. Did we just? Okay. And then Sherry Daly put, it's interesting how times change. The billboard is advertising cigarettes.
Yes.
it satisfies.
It satisfied with an old cigarette. And of course, Grant Wood smoked, and they said when he really was busy or in his head, sometimes he'd have 2 cigarettes in his mouth. Shows you he was concentrating on what he was doing. So the first question was about the art fairs in Stone City. Yeah, so Stone City fortunately has kept some of the Grant Wood Festival in its area. It's the 3rd Sunday of every year. Unfortunately, with COVID, they didn't have one this year, but they still bring a lot of, they still ask a lot of artists to come to Iowa and bring their artwork. So you could have local artists, you could have artists from across the country. And I don't know if they do it today, but they used to give away prizes. There was quite an art community that would still come and still does, but it's very much pared down compared to what it used to be. But yeah, it's still happening. It's just we want to keep it alive, keep it going.
The 3rd Sunday of which month?
September.
Okay, thank you.
You bet.
I just wanted to mention that by reading the book, it just perked my interest in so many pieces of his work that I wasn't familiar with. And I was, at first I was thinking, why didn't she include some of these pictures in the book, being the lazy person I can be? But then of course, today you can just go online and find everything, and including the stained glass window, which was really a surprise to me. So
yes. Beautiful. And I have to tell you, one of the reasons to write a novel or write fiction too, and Paul and Barbara can tell you this, to get the rights to a lot of Grant Wood work is very expensive, very expensive. And so, yeah, it was, I'll just be honest and transparent, it's more affordable for me to just write a novel than trying to do, the women and men that write the books on Grant Wood with the beautiful pictures, they're getting grants to do that work. Yeah. But no, I'm with you. I would have loved to included a lot of that feel and look. Absolutely. And also one of the things I'm going to share with all of you too, to show this to you real quick, but I have created a website called Stories of Iowa. I've just started it, but I'm inviting anybody, no matter where they live, if it's a story of Iowa or the Midwest, to submit it. We also have poetry on this site. It's interesting, I'm learning a lot about poetry. I have a colleague by the name of Elaine Mattingly that does Grant Wood poetry. But feel free, if you have a story on the Midwest, it has an Iowa feel to it, or even an Indiana feel to it. We just want to have this repository of storytelling about the Great Midwest. The other thing I'm going to have Hilda send out to all of you is also my son helped me create a virtual tour of the book. My son is a map maker. It's the easiest way to say it. He does GIS work, but he has a storyboard that allows you to tell a story on the left and show the image on the right. I will send this to you, but if you want to see the locations of the book, their actual locations, you can follow this on a link that I'll make sure Hilda, I send to you and you can send out to the group.
Dorothy, I might mention some things in regards to what Kathy said about the window, the stained glass window. For our Indiana viewers, this particular building, the Veterans Memorial Building, is actually on an island in the middle of the Cedar River going through Cedar Rapids. And in the last over a decade, it's been threatened twice. The floods came up in 2008 and devastated Cedar Rapids, and the bottom part of the window was affected by that, and a cost to clean it and restore it. And then just this summer or early fall, we had something called a derecho, which is like a hurricane that passed through Cedar Rapids, and 60% of their trees went down. But fortunately, the stained glass window was not damaged. It faces the south, and this came from the west, and I think that's what saved the window.
Wow.
Yes, and thank you for that, Paul, because in this virtual tour, I show a picture of that place that he just described. So yes, thank you. I forgot to make that connection too, but it's a beautiful window. And part of, Kathy, what I appreciate that you shared is that I did want to make people curious about this area of Iowa, about Grant Wood. So a lot of people said, yeah, you had me looking up a lot of information. Oh, it's a lot. But part of it was to draw the curiosity about this book. And I remember when I was writing it, I was living in Colorado at the time, and I went to the University of Colorado and took a creative writing class for a semester. And I remember I read a part of this book to my teacher, still not sure if I was a writer or I could do this. And the teacher said, "How did you come up with this idea?" And I told her. And I said, it was those stories such as Bridges of Madison County and Field of Dreams, or what is the book of Shoeless Joe Jackson, really did make me believe I had a story I could tell. And what was really great at the time is the professor said, I think this is a better story because it's depression, it's an artist in the middle of cornfields, bringing art to an area, and that's quite a story. And the reason I just mentioned that is that just gave me the courage, to be honest with you, to think that maybe we had a story here.
I'd like to add a little bit about the story behind the stained glass window and how very important it was. Grant Wood was given the commission to do that window in 1928. And he hadn't had any experience working with glass. So he had a trip, he took a trip. Turned out he took this trip to Germany because they had the best glass makers and artists. And he learned a great deal from them. But he also, while he was there, went around in museums, and those museums, without looking at Impressionism, which at that time he thought that's what he had to do, he saw portraits of people and how these Fleming, they were portraits of people from in art where they took a person and he thought about his mother and how he could put her in a costume, and he came up with the idea of what turned out to be Woman with Plants. He was over there and he realized you can look in your own backyard. You don't have to be following what's going on in France. And he came back from that trip basically a changed man, and he was inspired through his friend Jay Sigmund to do this before he went on the trip. And Jay Sigmund's home is the home that's being depicted in the Getting Back to Spring in Town. So it's all very, very important. The window wasn't accepted by people in Cedar Rapids because he had gone to Germany, and this was after World War I. And even though he was depicting veterans from each of the wars that we had participated in up to that time, there were some complaints. And so there was a great deal of controversy surrounding that painting, but or that glass work, but it's very, very important.
Thank you for that, Barbara. And I want everybody to know who Barbara is. Barbara actually has worked in the Lynn County Historical Center. She's also worked at 5 Turner Alley, which is Grant Wood's former studio, but now is a museum. But she's also an author of Grant Wood work. So she's written The Road to Wabeek and the Creation of an Artist. So you just got some fabulous information right there from someone who's lived there and worked it and has talked with many people along her ways in her research. Thank you for that, Barbara.
Thank you, Dorothy.
Yeah.
Do any of you wood scholars know whether any attempt was ever made to connect Stone City up with the WPA to get funding for the work that they were doing there?
The Stone City Art Colony, many, many of those people were very involved with the WPA, very involved. But it came after, in fact, you know, that the New Deal, all of that came after. That's when they were trying to repair the damage, basically, that had been done financially through the Depression.
And this wasn't Grant Wood's first, you could say, art colony. In fact, he was really good at taking old buildings or structures or homes and bringing artists to them. In fact, he had taken a mansion in Cedar Rapids prior to 1932-33 and basically restored it by getting people to, you know, live there and do their art and their writing there. He had a couple of friends who had a store in the lower area of the mansion. So he really had this great model or framework in his mind of taking older structures, bringing artists to it to work, hone their craft. And he acted and served as kind of the, you know, the mentor or the father. In fact, when I talked to Isabelle Bloom, that's one of the things she said. He was the father figure to all of us and just guided the process and guided them in their careers. But very benevolent, always helping to people with connections and finding their way through art.
I'm not sure which of the art colonies was involved, but we had a show of Gil Wilson's art with letters, and there was a letter from Grant Wood. He had written to Grant Wood, and Grant Wood said, "Oh, you need to come to my art colony. You really need to, you know." And he was very unsure. He didn't come to it, but it would have been interesting for him to have done that.
So this is a great connection that you're making with that artist from
Yes.
Indiana
Yes.
to Iowa.
Yeah, it was a very special show in general.
Grant Wood was incredibly talented and did a lot more than painting. And going along with the stained glass, he helped design one of the first funeral parlors in the country, which is how his 5 Turner Alley became his studio, because he helped develop this. And one of the funny things, I think, is that he put a pink tinted glass window in the funeral parlor, which was called Turner's Funeral Parlor. And he did that so that the body, the light would shine through and make the body look a little bit better than the paleness of death. And butchers picked up on this and started using pink windows in their butcher shops to make their meat look more appetizing. So there's a talent I'll bet you didn't know about, Grant Wood.
Wow. I did know that works though, because I once had a very crummy apartment in Bloomington, and the bathroom was painted pink, and you went in there in the morning and you just looked wonderful. I wanted to spend the whole day there. It was beautiful.
Dorothy,
go ahead, Hilda.
Sheila from the Davenport Museum had a bad attitude problem, and it made me upset. I'm like, she should be helping Patrice, but is that based on someone?
It is, and like I was saying earlier, that was my experience of sitting in what was the Davenport Museum of Art at the time. And the curator walks me into this room because I had wanted to see the brooch. And I was also looking through Nan Wood Graham's scrapbooks. And at the time, see, none of this was on the internet. So I'm going through these old scrapbooks. They were really tall and bounded by, you know, like a shoestring kind of, but she kept every newspaper article, everything on Grant. And so they had his estate through her bringing that to the Davenport Museum of Art. But it was a curator who asked me, why are you interested in this? And I said, well, I'm thinking about writing a book. And she said, you know, we want to get rid of all of this. No one, you know, basically they felt that no one was really paying attention to it. She felt it should go to Chicago, where American Gothic is, and she was going to ship it all away, his entire estate. And I said, please don't do that. And that's why I talked to the woman about the Iowa State Quarter saying, you know, they're wanting to get rid of this. This is our state treasure. Please don't let them do that. And so that's based on a real curator. And in fact, when I talked to the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art real recently, they said, we think we know who that might have been. Because they did have a sense that there was a person there who didn't appreciate it, you know. But you know, part of that, writing that into the story, was to show that even Iowans sometimes didn't understand what they had. And just like what Barbara was talking about, is that, you know, a lot of you know art very well. And for someone like me who kind of bloomed into it late, we don't understand that sometimes when you look at art, you take from it the meaning that it means to you. But the more I really researched and studied his art, what amazed me was Grant had a lot of the values we grew up with in Jones County. The humor. You didn't like people, like I think of his painting Appraisal, where the two women are praising each other. We don't like judgments. We don't like to be judged, you know. Common decency, or just the beauty for the land. Those are values I grew up around, probably like all of you. And so once you realize that's mirroring you from a painting, I really understood Grant, and I understood his paintings, and I saw them now very differently. So that was a turning point in the book too, where you see that Patrice really cares about what she has, what's around her, about her home state. And so that was written as a turning point for her. And I have to tell you, it was one of the things that took me the longest about writing that book, was having to say negative things about my home state. I remember I had someone read the first manuscript. Why doesn't she want to come home? Well, I was struggling with that, because I'll tell you, every time I fly into, it's going to hit me right now, I fly into the Cedar Rapids airport, I'm in tears. I fly out of that airport, I'm in tears. And so Patrice does not depict my attitude on Iowa, but I had to create that conflict. And so the hardest part about finishing that book was having to say things about Iowa that I hear other people say all the time, and I don't like it, and I want to reframe that. So the book is also meant to reframe Iowa. And in fact, this website, The Story of Iowa, too, is to reframe how people think of Iowa, because it is a great state. It's a beautiful state, just like Indiana, often unappreciated, often stereotyped. And those are some of the things that I would, you know, truly, I'm being very transparent with you, I'd like to break the glass ceiling on as well.
Dorothy, well, all of you who are doing with research, but particularly through this book, I have to thank you personally for an insight that I took from the book, that here in Terre Haute, Indiana, we have gone through the smokestack failure and the loss of industry and trying to reinvent ourselves as a community. And there's a great deal of discussion about quality of place and how one builds a community and how communities survive through time and build up some sort of local heritage that attracts people to come, but also causes people to stay, and especially succeeding generations. And that's one of the things about this book, that it showed me how much influence, sort of sub rosa, that Stone City had, that even though people didn't talk about it and didn't commercialize it, didn't make a big deal of it, they really hung on to it. They hung on to Isabelle Bloom's shop, and they hung on to the imagery, and they had the pictures in everybody's dining room. And that interested me because that does bring people into a sort of an unspoken camaraderie. And art does that in a way that not very much else does. Maybe Great Hardship, but I would prefer it be art to Great Hardship that really does give you a sense of place and a reason to root in that place. So I thank you again for the book for that insight too.
Thank you. That's well said. That's very well said. It's exactly it, that sense of place. And you're right. I would say that's something about my perspective on Iowa. I don't know if those of you on the session today from Iowa believe this, but I just think that it's a wonderful place, and we are very humble about it. We don't speak about it. You know, we don't commercialize it. We don't, and I don't want it to be commercialized either, but I want it to be honored. But you're right, Iowans don't talk about what's great about Iowa. They don't. They're very quiet and humble about that. But in not talking about it, then other people get to place their value on it or their opinions on it. And I do think, to your point too, we need to speak up about it and say, hey, this is a great place, just like Indiana is a great place. Because if we don't, you know, others will bring their opinions, others who don't know a lot about this area of Iowa. And there's a lot of scholars writing about Grant Wood and a lot of books out about Grant Wood that are very good. But what I love about what Barbara and I and Paul and Elaine are trying to do is give the local perspective as well. Because I feel like if you understand the local perspective, you understand the artist.
Dorothy, let me comment that your comments about Iowa, isn't that pretty much a Midwestern thing? I think that whether it be Minnesota or Wisconsin or Indiana or Ohio, we're not self-aggrandizers. We don't promote ourselves in that way. And it's a little bit different than the East Coast and the West Coast, I would say.
Absolutely.
I can agree with that. I'm from New York, and I was kind of dragged here, and I would never, now I love New York State, but I would never, ever want to live in New York City. I'm very lucky because I get to go back and visit family, or at least I did until recently, and take advantage of the great parts of New York City, but there is no way on earth that I would have wanted to raise my kids there. And doing the research that I've done by working in museums here in Cedar Rapids and Eastern Iowa, I fell in love with Iowa and I wouldn't leave. It's a fabulous place to live. Thank you, Dorothy, for sharing.
I'm sorry, Barbara.
No, that's okay.
There are a couple of questions. Well, the question and a comment. I guess Debbie Bielstein, I hope I'm saying that correctly, shared a link about a seminar about Veterans Memorial Window.
Oh, thank you, Debbie.
Well, I'll add to that because I don't know if the image came through, but a number of years ago, I was invited to come to Irving, Texas to see a seminar about the memorial window. And coming from Cedar Rapids was Terry Van Dorsten. I probably messed up her name, but she gave the seminar, and I tried to share the image of my friend from Texas who invited me and Terry and myself in front of a replica of the window. And also they had discovered, I don't remember when, but original sketches that had been either rolled up or hidden somewhere, and they have now framed them, and they're the actual images that Grant did of the different soldiers. And anyway, I uploaded some of those pictures on a Facebook page I have. And I don't, like I said, I don't know if the image came through there. But I just want to add one other little anecdote. So I've become friends with Dorothy and Paul, And I shared a picture from the 1980s with Dorothy, and my niece was goofing around or whatever, and it had a lot of background things. So Dorothy commented to me, she said it was funny for her to see inside a California home with so many homages to Iowa. And because we have a lot of Grant Wood, prints and plates and, so anyway, I thought that was kind of cute. And I'll just add.
Yes, Debbie, tell them who you are.
Well, I was just going to add as reference. So my father is from Williamsburg, Iowa. His aunt, Clara Peck, from Marengo, married Frank Wood, who is Grant Wood's older brother. And so my great aunt was Grant's sister-in-law and Nan Wood Graham. So anyway, in 1960, Frank and Clara Wood moved from Waterloo to San Diego, California, where my grandmother was living. And so that's when I met Frank, my Uncle Frank, my great Uncle Frank. And I also met Nan and Ed Graham, and, until their deaths, had a lifelong relationship with all of them as family. So anyway, so I have a little tribute page to them. And so I always say I have to thank my great Aunt Clara for marrying into the Wood family, because that's how I knew all of them.
That's awesome. Thank you. Dorothy, we have 2 more questions on here.
Okay, you bet.
So Diane Keys was asking, so the artist Diane is Gilbert Wilson from Terre Haute. And then she was asking about, can you expand about the number of scrapbooks that Nan had and where they are located now? And then Kathy Laska was asking, did Grant Wood and Benton get along, because she heard that Thomas was not very kind to Grant, but the photo made them look like they were buds. So, and how long do you guys want to still go, Dorothy? Are you good on time? And
I'm good on time. I told you all I could go to midnight.
Okay.
I'm just teasing. But I just want to circle back to Debbie, and then I'll answer some of these other questions too. So Debbie and I met at, well, we were introduced, I believe, by Paul Jewell, but Debbie and I also attended what's called the Iowa Reunion here in Southern California. It's an Iowa reunion that has been going on for 120 years of Iowans who've moved out to Southern California. And we go on the USS Iowa, a battleship, and we have our reunion, and I got to meet Debbie. So Debbie, in spending many Thanksgivings and Christmases with Frank Wood and Nan Wood Graham, so think about that. She had these 2 incredible people in the room all of her life. And her and I get to meet, and one day we meet at a restaurant, and Debbie brings a shoebox, and she opens the shoebox, and here is all of this wonderful Grant Wood Festival items. One was a doll, it looked like Woman with Plants, that Nan Wood Graham, who was our Grand Marshal for these parades and these festivals, brought back to California and gave to Debbie. So imagine someone opening a shoebox and you're seeing something from over 40 years ago that you haven't seen for a very long time.
I also had the wooden nickel, which has Grant Wood Days on it. And then I told Dorothy about the doll, and Nan, of course, kept a doll herself. And so being, I think, a teenager at the time, but a young teenager. And so I said to Nan, I said, is this, I looked at the shoes. I think I showed you, Dorothy, the dolls that were made, probably quite a few of them had, the doll I got had mismatched shoes. And so I remember being a little like, oh, I want one with matched shoes. So anyway, so that's kind of a funny thing. But yeah, she did. She gave me, she was very generous. She gave a lot of us, and she'd always write her name on any book that she gave us or any print of art. And she once gave me a miniature American Gothic And she said, to Debbie, love Nan Wood Graham, or, you know, so that's very special. It's in a little plastic frame.
So the question on the scrapbooks is perfect because I'm going to bring Debbie into this so she knows what I'm going to do here. But the scrapbooks, so Nan had several scrapbooks. I'm not quite sure. And Debbie,
I
you
think
probably know.
about 18. I think
18?
I'm not. There's quite a few, and they're all
Yes.
digitized, as you know, so you can tell that part of it.
Yes, they're digitized thanks to the Davenport Figge Museum. I think the University of Iowa too takes some credit in that. But there's one scrapbook that's not digitalized. You want to tell Debbie about that one?
So I was very interested in the movie stars of the Golden Age, and Nan knew that. And in the early 70s, she had a gift for me, and it was a scrapbook that she had kept in the 1930s of seeing all of the stars in New Mexico. And I think she and her husband lived in New Mexico for a while because maybe he was sick, or I can't remember exactly. But it was all her impressions of the stars that she saw. And a couple of the stories that she wrote about, one in particular is my favorite, where she and her husband visited the home of Edward G. Robinson. And he owned Daughters of Revolution. And she had ended up, she called it like her greatest thrill or something in my scrapbook. And she wrote that she had given Mrs. Robinson one of the teacup that Grant used in as, you know, reference for Daughters of Revolution. But God only knows what happened to that teacup because, of course, I think Stavros Niarchos ended up buying the painting, and then after that it went to some museum. I can't remember which, but who knows? Hopefully it didn't end up in some antique shop for, you know, because the Robinsons, of course, had gotten divorced, I think, at some point too. So anyway,
Yeah.
yes, I have one of Nan's scrapbooks. I did myself took it to a place that does digital work. So the whole thing, each page is digitized. And I did send a DVD or a CD to the Figge so they could keep it, you know, in their archives. They didn't publish it or anything. I have it published on my page, but yep, I have one of Nan's scrapbooks in her own handwriting. And the other piece of it is Nan hadn't written her name in it. So my mom said to her, Nan, why don't you write your name in this? Or maybe I said it. And so she did, and she wrote it and put little squiggly lines around it, you know. So that was fun.
So yeah, thank you for digitalizing that, Debbie, because I also think it's great too that you sent it to the Figge. But that's just kind of a little extra piece today that a lot of people don't know that there's one that's missing, and that's because Debbie has it. But Nan was, you know, I want to talk a little bit too, and I'll come to the Thomas Hart Benton question here too in a moment. Those scrapbooks were getting worn out at the Figge because so many people had come to see them. And so they were taking them away from the public to really view them. So we're so happy that they did get that all digitalized. But Nan was part of, you know, we talked about the protection that this group had around Grant. And in fact, Isabelle Bloom and her husband, John Bloom, were also part of what was called the Circle of Friends. And these Circle of Friends would come back to the Grant Wood art festivals every year. And they were all these artists that had worked or had Grant as a teacher, or they were interning with him. They were basically his students, but they were called Grant Wood Circle of Friends, and they all lived across the United States. They were great artists in and of themselves, but they were very protective of him and his legacy. And in fact, I am writing a second book now to really speak to that piece around going back to Stone City and talking about the legacy of Paul Engel, the director of the Iowa Writers Workshop, the one who really got that workshop world renowned, and his linkage actually to Grant Wood. But I'm going to talk a lot too about the circle of friends that were very protective of Grant and his legacy and why that was. So more to come on that. Thomas Hart Benton, it's interesting because Thomas Hart Benton was, he was, from what I've read and what I've known about him, he was a fiery guy. You know, he said it like it was. And I could see there being contention with him, but there's a lot of stories where these three regionalists spend a lot of time together. They joked around together. Grant visited Thomas Hart Benton in Missouri, vice versa. And in fact, when Grant died, and there was a lot of controversy about Grant Wood and the University of Iowa and his work there, Thomas Hart Benton at the end was very vocal about just, once again, protecting Grant Wood and reminding everybody of the legacy he left and what a great artist he was. So they might have had contention, I don't know, but there was also a lot of loyalty across these three and for the work they were trying to do and the impact and the difference they were trying to make. That's a little bit I know on the Thomas Hart Benton. In fact,
I'd like to just, this is not a question, but a comment, coupling in a little bit on what Fred Nation said. A great trip from Iowa is to go north to the Twin Cities, a great city, then go across northern Wisconsin, see Green Bay area, Door County, cross over to Mackinac, come down western Michigan, spend time at the Indiana Dunes, then come across northern Illinois back to Iowa. It's a great trip, beautiful scenery, nice people. You'd all enjoy it.
I love that.
Sounds like a plan. Do you have any other questions from the chat, Hilda?
Nope.
Okay, well, we have imposed upon you people for an hour and a half, and it has been a delight. I thank you. Dorothy, I thank you for writing the book to begin with and for making the effort to help our reading group, Page and Palette, get a much more interesting and in-depth understanding of not only the process of writing the book, but what it means to you and what it means to the reader and to the other Wood scholars. Thank you so very much for participating in this with us today.
Thank you.
Just delightful, and I cannot thank you enough.
Thank you. Thank you. I do have a question for all of you. It is off the record a little bit, but being from your area of Indiana, are you familiar with, are you basketball fans? That's probably a crazy question to ask people from Indiana.
Yeah.
Have you heard the name of Zeller?
Zeller.
Yeah.
No.
Fred knows everyone. Fred?
Yes, certainly we know the Zeller name in basketball in Indiana. Cody Zeller.
Okay. So Cody's mother was our neighbor, and she was my best friend growing up, and so was his dad. But they come from this area of Iowa. They ended up in southern Indiana. They had 3 sons that went off to play pro basketball, and they all were Mr. Indiana basketball, but they are from our area of the country.
Well, we're glad to share them with you.
Well, it's funny, I have a magnet that someone had bought me of a parody of American Gothic, and it had Indiana on it, and it has the farmer is holding a basketball. They're all in basketball regalia, and now I have a little better understanding why American Gothic is wearing, you know, Indiana. I'm looking at it right now on my refrigerator. Huh. Yep. Instead of the pitchfork, he's got the basketball.
He's got the basketball.
I'm enjoying the cloud over your head, Fred. That looks really nice.
Well, I wondered about that. Maybe that gives the wrong impression. But who's the Peanuts character? Was it the one around with the cloud over his head? But in any case,
I thought it was a speech bubble.
This is by John Rogers Cox, who is an artist from Terre Haute and was the first director of the Swope and is responsible for buying Spring in town when he was the director curator of the Swope.
I love that story, Fred. Did you say he was like 26 years old and given a checkbook and told
Yes.
to go find some great art? And
And he
he had
did.
good taste.
Well, this was a taste, absolutely. His grandson is here today from New York. He is the judge for the 76th annual Wabash Valley exhibition, which has artists from 5 Midwestern states participating in it.
Oh, wonderful. That's so wonderful. No, thank you to all of you, and thank you for reading the book, and thanks to the Swope for, I love our relationship. It's been fabulous, and I can't thank you all enough. And if you have any questions, I will send my email address to Hilda. And Hilda, I'll also send this other virtual tour too, so everybody can see all the places that are in the book. And thank you very much for your interest in the book and in Iowa, but especially Grant Wood.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dorothy.
Thank you.
All
Bye-bye,
right.
all.
Take
Thank
care.
you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.